Welcome back, I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Review. This week we are looking at a design with the title Air. It was for an online competition, so it was judged by the image that you see on the screen in front of you, and it didn't place in the competition. I wasn't overly concerned because I just felt like it was a little bit unfinished in the design, but I did want to put in an entry. When I look at it now, I'm a little bit concerned about the finish on the base, and that the blue to me is fairly dominant in that base, even though that was supposed to be the sky in my interpretation, but I haven't really followed through that interpretation in terms of the design itself. So as you see it in front of you, it's a timber base, circular base that's been painted blue. From it there is a flexible piece of solid wire. Now this is something that comes from a hardware store or a building supply store, and it screws into the base, and then it can be manipulated into all different shapes, but it does take a little bit of effort to do it. It's quite a solid piece of wire, and what that means though is it gives you a really good structure. I've placed it to one side of the circle so that I can use the remaining negative space that will be created by putting placements against it to be part of the design. And my thinking about it was that I really wanted that negative space to be part of the design. The plant material I've used there are dried strelitzia leaves, so bird of paradise, and these are one of my favourites to use in terms of movement and rhythm and shape in a design, because you simply cut the leaf and leave it to dry. You don't have to do anything special to it, and they all dry differently, as you can see, and so you get all sorts of wonderful shapes that you can use in designs. They take about 6 weeks to dry, just naturally, wherever you can put them. Interspersed with that, I've made a structure from woven raffia. That is a system where you do 3 or 5 wires and you just do the weaving in and out. Once again, it gives you that flexibility to give you the shape. So I've tried to mimic the movement shape of the strelitzias in that placement to give it a bit more solidity around the wire support, so that's not quite so dominant. And then I've put some dried grasses into it just to, once again, give it a little bit more movement. My concern with those ones is that they're a little bit too straight in their form, and they should have been a little bit more curled to reinforce that movement, that swirling air motion that comes to mind when you first look at some of this design. So let's now have a look at what our AI design eye has got to say in terms of the principles and elements as they relate to this design, and perhaps some suggestions for improvement, although, as I've said, I already know some of the things that I would like to improve in the design. Looking at line, first of all, line is the defining element of this design. Sweeping calligraphic curves dominate, created by manipulated natural materials and fine linear extensions. These lines float, loop and travel through space, giving the work its sense of lift and continuous motion. There's no rigid axis. The lines feel free, exploratory and responsive. So one of the things about using that solid wire as the framework is that I can give it that fluid shape that is then reflected in the plant material that's placed there. So in terms of structure and support for your designs, it's an interesting thing to keep in mind when you are planning your designs, that the structure needs to enhance your interpretation of that class title rather than just be a support for the plant material that you're going to put into the design. Form now. The form is open, suspended and asymmetrical, reading as a mobile rather than a grounded structure. This design occupies space lightly with forms that appear to hover rather than sit. The absence of visual mass reinforces the concept of air as something present yet intangible. So because there's so much movement in that top part of the design, it does, as it says, feels like it's suspended and rather than mobile in the strict sense of floral art, it's probably more like a stable design, so it gives the impression of movement even though it's a static design. The placement of the very twisted strelitzia leaf on the base brings your eye back down, so it reinforces that that base is part of the design, but I still think it's too dominant personally. We'll see later on what our AI thinks of it. If we look at space now, space is used masterfully. Negative space is the primary design partner, allowing each line and form to breathe. The separation between elements creates clarity and enhances the illusion of weightlessness. The design relies on surrounding air to complete the composition, and this is very important for us to think about. I know that in other videos I've talked about negative space. I've tried to show you how negative space becomes part of the design, but in something where you're interpreting an intangible element like air, it becomes the suggestion of air and air movement, and you can only do that with negative space. So you can frame the negative space with your curved plant material or the movement of plant material, but to do it successfully, you need to ensure that every part of your design, as it says here, can be seen and is adding to that overall composition of the design. Texture. Textures are subtle and refined from smooth manipulated plant surfaces, fibrous hair-like linear materials to soft matte natural tones. These textures are intentionally understated, supporting delicacy rather than drawing attention to themselves. So for those of you who have followed the series, you'll know that texture is the thing that I do focus on as the way of giving contrast in a design. And whilst there is still contrast in the design, the textures contrasts are subtle, and it comes with the movement, and even though the movement that's indicated is similar and there's a rhythm to it and a pattern to it, it's made of different materials, but they're not competing in terms of their contrasts. They're just sort of subtle grades of the same sort of texture. The fibrous hair-like linear materials are the dried ferns, and the more I look at it, as often happens with these videos, the more I look at it, the more unhappy I am with the choice of that particular plant material. It would have been so much better. You just think about that design, and had I had a maidenhair fern or some tillandsia, something that I could curl around a little bit more, still wispy in terms of its texture and its form, but had a bit more of the actual movement rather than those very straight lines, which to me are jarring a little bit at the moment. Colour. The colour palette is minimal and restrained, dominated by soft neutrals with a controlled accent of blue in the structural line. This single colour note anchors the design while still allowing the overall impression to remain light and atmospheric. So it's not seeing an issue with the blue base, and in fact the wire support is a darker blue as well. I guess because the neutrals are against it, I just still think it's too much. That blue base is drawing my eye. Then I look up, and I would have preferred if the judges looked at the design and then looked down and saw that the base was holding it all together, rather than be drawn to the base first of all, because even though it's timber, it's not really enough plant material to be part of the design for the judging on this particular occasion. Value and tone. Mid to light values dominate, avoiding heaviness. The consistent tonal range enhances cohesion and prevents any one element from visually weighing the design down. See, this is where I disagree with this interpretation, is that I feel like the design is weighed down by that base, and I would like to see it. I was thinking, as I was talking, I was thinking a lighter blue, but I think even that's not quite right. And I think had I done it in the beige and brown tones, it would then look very flat as a design. It needs a contrast to give it the depth and to give it the grounding that the design needs. So I'd have to really look at what I could do, and maybe that's where I could introduce a texture, and I could have it covered in sand, or rather than painted, so have it in the colour and tone of the rest of the plant material, but have it texturally quite different. So sand or seed heads, some of the native seed heads are quite textural and would cover that base. Or I could use brown rice, that might work as well. Interesting, an interesting exercise. Pattern. Pattern appears through the repetition of curved forms and recurring linear gestures. This repetition creates rhythm without symmetry, reinforcing natural flow. So had I had rhythm symmetrically, it would look like a very flat design, whereas this gives it a little bit of depth and a little bit of contrast and in the movement, and so it intrigues you and makes it feel like the whole design is moving. So as I talked about it being a very mobile looking design because the symmetry isn't there. Balance. The design achieves dynamic asymmetrical balance. The visual weight is distributed through movement rather than mass, with opposing curves and extensions counterbalancing one another across the composition. So it is balanced, even though it extends further than the base. It still looks balanced because those two outside leaves curl back in towards the design. It gives it that balance. The placement of the strelitzia leaf on the base itself cuts that base area, and so it balances out visually rather than being too visually heavy on the base area, even though the base has got a whole lot of other problems which we've talked about on the way through. Dominance and focal area. There's no single focal point. Instead, dominance shifts as the eye moves, encouraging exploration. This aligns strongly with the theme. Air cannot be pinned down or confined to one place. So an interesting observation again is that if you're doing an interpretive design like this, you don't necessarily have to have a single focal point. If you've got a lot of movement in the design and it still reflects the class title and it's still balanced, then the focal area doesn't have to be a single place in the design, because you're looking at the whole design and you're moving through the design continuously. You don't get stopped at any particular point. Contrast. Contrast is subtle rather than dramatic. Solid versus fine, curved versus linear, anchored base versus floating forms. These contrasts add interest while preserving harmony. And I think we probably talked about contrast when we talked about textures and about balance, that we've talked about contrast, and you need to have contrast in a design, and how you interpret and how you manage that contrast, for me, is often through texture. For some people it's through colour, and it's interesting to see that in this one the contrast is subtle. It's there, but it's subtle. It's not in your face. It's not the dominant part of the design that the judges would necessarily look at and say, oh, that works well, that doesn't work well. You have to think about the design a little bit more and look into it a little bit more, and then see that there is the contrast there, rather than be shouting at you, shall we say. Rhythm and movement. Movement is continuous and flowing. The eye travels effortlessly along curves and extensions, mimicking the way air currents move, never stopping, never static. And that's very true, and I think that was an important part of my interpretation for this design, is that I wanted it to look as though it was continually moving, because in terms of air, that was how I felt, that when the air currents are around us all the time, it is continuously moving. And so I wanted that implied movement to be the most important part of my interpretation of the class title. Proportion. Proportions are finely judged. The scale of each element feels intentional, with no component overpowering another. The base supports without dominating. Well, here we disagree. I do think it dominates. I do think that even a smattering of sand along it, even if I had done swirls of sand, that would have helped the interpretation, added the contrast, not taken away from the movement, all of those sorts of things. So that would definitely be something that I would try another time. Scale. The scale feels intimate yet expansive. While physically modest, the design suggests far greater spatial reach due to its open construction. And once again, that's because we've used the negative space. So the negative space internally within the design, as well as the way that the movement makes you move out just towards the edges of the design, makes it appear much larger and much more of an impact than if you looked at just the components that make up the design, because really there's not very much in it, but it does give you a sense of air movement, and within the scale they're all to scale as it suggests. Harmony and unity. Unity is exceptional. Consistent material language, restrained colour and cohesive line quality ensure the design reads as a single poetic statement. So it is harmonious and it is unified, apart from my concerns with that base colour particularly. And so that's rewarding to see that those components in terms of the movement, the negative space, the subtle contrast in the design have all added to it being harmonious and unified as a design. So let's have a look now at some of the suggestions of things that I could think about for this particular design. The first one is refine the line hierarchy by allowing one curve to take clearer visual leadership. And I think that's probably a very good suggestion. What I would have to do if I was looking at one of those curves taking the hierarchical position would be to ensure that it stayed within scale and proportion, and that it did keep you moving into the design and it didn't become the dominant focal area of the design, that it just became a part of the design that led you back into the rest of the design. Adjust spacing slightly between two elements to enhance depth and layered movement. And once again, I think that these two are related, which is why I put them on the same screen, is that had I had a larger curve to have the visual leadership, if I layered that, you look at the top of that design, they're almost all on the same level one way or another, and I just need to dimensionally bring one of those curves down a little bit so that we get that implied movement through the design without it relying on the plant material to move your eyes through the design. It's a stepping up rather than a swirling motion. I'm using my hands again, which is not help to you because you can't see them. Number 3, strengthen the base dialogue by subtly echoing an upper line gesture below. So this is what I talked about with perhaps using swirls of sand on that base, because that would echo some of that movement. It would almost look like a shadow of the placements at the top. And in fact, I could do it that way. If I put a good enough light over the top of it, I could shadow shape on the base and then put the sand onto it so that it created that look, or the rice, whatever I was using in those brown tones. Number 4, test rotational balance to ensure equal visual interest from all viewing angles. Now this is a suggestion, had this been a design that was going to be placed on the plinth, perhaps, where it was judged all around, then you would have to look at it from every angle. Because it was judged, it was an online competition, so it was judged from the image. I chose where I would take the image so that it would display the design to its best qualities. But if it was on a plinth and it was judged all around, then you would have to be very careful, because that line of plant placement at the moment, if you looked at it, say from the left-hand side, it would look like a straight line, a diagonal line across the space that is allowed. So there would have to be some depth at every angle for it to be appropriate for an all-around design. So that's just something to think about in terms of if this topic came up again and it was being judged in a different way, that would be something that would have to be considered as well. So there we have our analysis for the design Air for this week. If you would like one of your own designs analysed and get this similar sort of report, you just go to the website, follow the instructions there, and within about 24 hours you'll have a report back that you can look at and use in terms of developing a design, whether it's pre-competition, post-competition, or just a practice, doesn't matter. The AI design eye will look at it all the same way and give you your feedback based on those principles and elements of design, which is what we should be basing our designs on as we move forward in our floral art journey. I will leave you for this week. I'm Kim Bailey, and that's Floral Art Review.